Welcome, everybody, to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno, episode 28. Today's guest is TSN broadcaster and CFL football insider Farhan Lalji. Farhan, thanks so much for being on today's episode. I super appreciate the time that you have to be featured on the show today.
Matthias, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So we got a lot of things going on now with the COVID situation in terms of professional sports, and the CFL is no exception for many of the storylines that have been fluttering around the league. What has been, at least on your end, the type of work and the things that you've had to deal with in terms of the ever-changing situation in terms of the CFL schedule, the draft, and also the potential of a season next year?
Yeah, I think it's everything. I mean, this is not a normal year for us, just from a coverage standpoint, as you'd imagine, right? I mean, normally we would have just gone through a Grey Cup week that would have ended a couple weeks ago and talking about a number of football storylines and then what's going to happen in the offseason, which coach is getting fired, who's getting hired, what player signings are going to happen. The list goes on. And there's been, for the longest period of time, there was a real lack of news. They went through the process, they got to August, and then there was no season, and then everybody tried to be real quiet about it. And it's tough because when you have a lack of news, people wind up offering speculation as news, and you want to really try to avoid that as much as you can. The league made certainly a positive step by announcing a schedule in what would have been Grey Cup week. Now, I think a lot of people said, okay, well, what does this actually mean? Does it mean we're going to have football 100%? Well, it doesn't. And the truth is that I think everybody needs to watch the CFL and cover the CFL similarly to how other professional sports gets covered. Because guess what's happening right now in the NHL? You're not sure if they're going to play. The players and owners haven't been able to figure it out financially. They know they don't want to do a bubble. Can they make the money work? Do we think they're going to play? We can, but no one can say definitively they can. Go look at NCAA football. Nobody can say on a week-to-week basis whether or not games are going to happen. But when we talk about it in a CFL context, people use a lot of negative connotations about Bush League or lack of professionalism and things like that. It's happening everywhere. So from the CFL perspective, the schedule was good, but do we need somebody to come out and say, no matter what happens, we're going to be able to play? I think that's going to be difficult to do, but it was a good step. Today, they announced that the business year is going to start on Monday, which means people are going to be able to sign free agents, their own free agents. And then in February, they're going to be able to sign, free agents that are available to everybody. So that's another positive step. And I think people are waiting for a guarantee. I know the players certainly indicated as such during Grey Cup Unite week. And I think it's probably an unrealistic ask.
And in all the years that you've covered the CFL, you can only imagine that the whirlwind of events within the last calendar year has probably been unlike anything that you've ever seen, maybe minus the American expansion. So in terms of what this means going forward for the free agents on each CFL team's roster, as well as the unrestricted free agents that then become available, do you think that there will be a bit of hesitancy coming from clubs to secure players? Or do you think that there will be that opportunity to feel that the 2021 season is going to become more real as time moves into the future?
No, I think people are going to try to sign GMs. I've talked to a bunch of them today, and I think they're going to be aggressive in terms of trying to get guys signed. I think people wanted some clarity as to what the business model was going to look like before they could dive into those situations. And I don't know that you're going to get a change in the short term, because the truth is that there's going to be a lot of pain financially on both sides. And the league's been feeling it, the players have been feeling it, and now you've got a situation where I'm not convinced they're gonna try to renegotiate the CBA. It's got one more year on it. The players have said, we don't feel the need to renegotiate. We're good. So then the owners have turned around and said, okay, well, we're just going to operate at the salary cap floor, not the ceiling. So we'll see if everybody can stay with that model. But at least now, individual teams have been able to set their own salary caps, and now they can go through their own grids and say, okay, this is what we're going to pay for this position. This is what we're going to pay for that position. They can go to existing players and ask them to take pay cuts. They can go to new players or players that are pending free agents in February and say, look, this is what we can offer you. And then it's going to be up to the players to decide if they think they're going to get a windfall at free agency. And what the last couple of years have shown us is that that's just not going to happen. So I think you'll see a lot of players that say, okay, I want to play. This is what I'll accept. And they'll do it because they just, when the music stops, they don't want to be without a chair, right? And that's what this comes down to. So I think a majority of players are going to sign contracts for less than what they'd like, but they'll sign them. And other players are going to have to make a decision with what they want to do with their lives.
How much do you think that that will affect the overall performance, or I guess, should I say, shake up the league in terms of the strength and weaknesses of teams, considering that the draft was almost by pure chance. And now with Hamilton, Winnipeg, and Saskatchewan, three teams that finished in the top four last year, now get the top three picks in this year's draft.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to matter much. Those guys don't make an impact in their first year. I mean, it's rare that the number one overall pick, I mean, if they can start, great. But in terms of making an impact and affecting your odds to win a Grey Cup, that's slim. So the draft itself is not going to be as good. You're going to have a number of players that opt out, right? I mean, I'm told as many as a third of draft eligible players that would have been top 100 guys are opting out because nobody's been charged any eligibility, right? So the U Sports guys are going back. The NCAA guys, many of them, that aren't NFL prospects, but they're CFL prospects, they may just say, look, I want to finish my degree. I want to start graduate school, right? Because there's just not enough money for me to come out for. So, or if you think you might have a chance by going back and taking a crack at the NFL by having another good year, you might do that. So I think the draft, which has been reduced from 8 rounds to 6 rounds, I think it's going to be as thin as it's ever been, and truthfully, I think some players made a mistake opting out. I think they should have stayed in the draft, knowing it was going to be a thinner draft. Plus, if they chose to go back to school, they could still do that. But I don't know that their draft grade or their draft stock is going to get inflated by waiting in many cases. So, in terms of how the draft relates to a 2021 season, I think it's minimal.
And you mentioned the aspect of in the CFL draft, first overall picks or first round picks seldomly have a ginormous effect on the overall performance and outcome of a team's chances to win the Grey Cup. But in terms of the longevity, I find it interesting that potentially, like you mentioned, some of the guys who could have stayed in maybe could find a way to make a name for themselves during the season, since things are so up in the air. And I think that the success of the teams from last season will probably continue forward with what will hopefully a 2021 season. And going forward, in terms of the likelihood of a season now, that's probably one of the most uncertain things that CFL fans have seen in a long time. Do you think, from the speculations that people made from before, that it would be possible that the CFL would potentially go under or collapse financially if they didn't play the 2021 season?
I think 2021 is imperative that the league plays. I just don't think that it can disappear from the country's consciousness for 2 full seasons and be able to pick up from the ashes. I just think that playing in 2020 was difficult optically, right? Because every other league played, and the CFL couldn't find a way to get even a shortened season done. And quite frankly, even without the government money, at least 6 of the 9 teams wanted to play anyway, and really got held hostage by the other 2 or 3 teams that said no. Now, in hindsight, the CFL may have dodged a bullet, because when you see what's happening across the country with COVID, could they have finished the season? And that would have looked unbelievably bad, right? I mean, the NFL, no matter what, they're going to put their head down and trudge forward. They're going to finish no matter how many people get COVID. That's just the way the NFL is going to be. I don't know that the CFL would have been able to function like that. I don't know that the province of Manitoba would have allowed them to function like that. So I think on some levels, the league dodged a bullet by not playing, but certainly optically at the front end, it wasn't a good look when every other league got off the ground, right? So, but as far as 2021, they have to play. They have to play. Even if it's in front of no fans or limited fans, and there's financial risk associated with that, I think everybody involved knows they need to find a way to get on the field. And hopefully by that point, a vaccine allows them to, get on the field in a much more meaningful way with at least some attendance.
No, to parlay that into other aspects of Canadian football, obviously we've seen the tragedy of the U Sports season being canceled, but again, in the same regard, the uncertainty of what that season would have looked like at this moment in time if they would have played is something that is probably we're glad that we're not thinking about. But in terms of, because U Sports is not a revenue generator nearly to the likes of the NCAA or like the CFL. So what do you think the scope of that may look like going forward if there is a potential that they don't play? Or do you think that it is imperative for 2021 that U Sports puts a football product on the field?
I don't know. I don't think they're dealing with the same type of margins that the CFL is. I think that if U Sports didn't play again, I mean, again, you mentioned it's not a revenue generator. right? And it's very campus dependent. And eventually people are going to be allowed back on university campuses. You know, the bigger risk is, are you going to stay online forever, right? Like as long as students come back, then eventually there'll be sports and eventually people will come back to stadiums, probably to the same numbers they did, which depending on where you go, wasn't significantly high to begin with. So for me, I think the sport of football can benefit by what's happened. They can't allow it to continue to happen, but I think there's a real opportunity for youth sports, for high school football, to youth football, to really reset itself and choose how they want to brand themselves and how they want to promote themselves as a sport. One of the things that I think is going to be a real benefit, an unintended consequence, which is a positive one, I think we're going to stop talking about concussions. I really believe that. And I don't mean stop 100%, but you know, I was president of BC high school football 10 years ago. And when this was such a big topic and we started to do mandatory baseline testing and reduction in contact in practice and change the way we coach and run the sport, much like they do in youth sports, we've spent so much time trying to fix the sport and or improve the sport, because ultimately it's still a contact sport. And you know, we still get a lot of oxygen given to the concussion topic. It's not as bad as it was 7, 8, 9 years ago, but it's still there in large numbers where parents are concerned. Well, I got news for you. Parents were more concerned about the pandemic. When the pandemic goes, I don't believe the concussion topic is going to generate the level of oxygen or occupy that amount of just conversation space that it did before. And I think that's a blessing for the sport of football, because we've spent so much time trying to fix it. Well, now we don't have this anchor that's going to be weighing us down to the level it was, and we could really rebuild it, right? And if we can push it and build it forward, you know, you've also got all these players now that are in the NCAA that are not linemen, they're skill position Canadians. We see what Chase Claypool's doing at the NFL, but there's another wave of skill position players, defensive backs, receivers, Chuba Hubbard at running back, quarterbacks that are going into the NCAA system, like these guys that eventually will make their way to the NFL, that we can really like lift ourselves up on their shoulders and promote the heck out of football. So it's not been good, but if you think about it differently, if you choose to not view yourself as a victim within your sport and say, this is the time we can use to really elevate our sport, it could do great things for football.
I 100% agree, Farhan, and especially when you mention the way that it will help reset from the anchor that has been concussions. And it's been almost a nonstop conversation ever since they released films about it and all the media news attention that's gathered. But now people are chomping at the bit to get back on the football field in high school in BC, in other places in Canada. And it's a blessing in disguise. And I like that you mentioned that, because now Football Canada can really look at the way in which they can elevate the sport. You mentioned the successes of the players in the NCAA, and it's not just linemen and guys where the rules don't change that much, where you see the success of Chase Claypool. I remember when I was playing for the Vancouver Island Raiders in 2015, guys who were John Barsby alumni mentioning, our team lost in the first round this year. It's uncharacteristic, but they lost to this team with a guy by the name of Chase Claypool. You know, I think he's going to be pretty good someday. And then seeing that come to life is truly one of the most transformational things for Canadian football high school players, because now they get to see this is real. This is possible. It's not just a pie in the sky dream anymore. You can't have Big Ben look at you as your number one target. So in saying that, with the success that Claypool has had, what do you think, or what have you found has been maybe some of the change in conversation around Canadian athletes in the NCAA ranks and amongst NFL teams?
Well, I mean, you know, I think it's good. It's positive, right? I mentioned before that usually if you were a Canadian playing in the NCAA, you were probably a lineman, right? And you just aren't going to get as much love on television. It just isn't going to happen that way. And so as a result, you're not necessarily in a position to inspire. Now, if you're Laurent Duvernay-Tardif and you play in the NFL and you play for a Super Bowl champion and you go back to med school and you make the ultimate sacrifice and you do all of these types of things, that's different. But that's not just a lineman story or a football story, right? So you need guys in positions that are going to do great things on Sunday that the rest of us can understand. So it's not just Chase, it's that next wave. And this year, without U Sports and without the CFL, myself and my colleague Dave Naylor have spent a lot of time on TSN talking about Canadians in the NCAA, and I know Football Canada has spent a lot of time promoting that as well. And it's remarkable just the number of skill position guys that are going to eventually make their way to the NFL. You look at John Mechie, who's like number 2 receiver now at the University of Alabama, and there's so many others that are in these spots that it's going to be really cool to watch them track. And as they do that, then the conversation changes, right? I mean, we need these types of players to be talked about in that league. We just do. I love the CFL and I love youth sports, but in terms of the sport at my level, coaching in high school and coaching in youth, if you want more kids playing, you need guys playing in the NFL and you need guys playing in the NCAA. Bottom line. And if that happens, all boats will rise because we'll get more kids and more conversation at the younger levels. Those kids will feed youth sports, which will in turn feed the CFL, and it'll make us all better. Because right now, the best players in the NCAA, a lot of those guys would be in the CFL 10 years ago, but now they're going to make their way to the NFL. It's going to be harder for the CFL to get quality Canadians. So you need to increase the base, right? And that'll help youth sports as well. So, it's a good thing that it's happening, and it's good we've got those guys to talk about.
And especially you mentioned the conversations you had with another insider, Dave Naylor, talking about the Canadians in the NCAA. You look at what Nathan Rourke had done in Ohio, as well as his brother carrying the torch, so to say, for him. Do you think that there is room for Canadians at quarterback to make a way for themselves to become more of a household position, let's say, in the CFL? Because obviously we understand as football people, the stigma around Canadians playing quarterback. Do you think that there's a potential for that to change with the rising number of Canadians to go into the NCAA?
Yes, and it has to come through that route. With all due respect to youth sports, the CFL people have a bias at that position. Bottom line. Like you can say, well, look, they understand the game better. It's they know the motions, they know the extra defender. Doesn't matter. Because when a GM at the CFL level looks at a youth sports quarterback, they will say they are throwing two slower athletes against slower athletes in wider windows. And when you get a guy in the NCAA throwing two faster athletes against faster athletes in tighter windows, the way that person gets viewed is completely different, right? And when you look at guys that are, Division III players that get a CFL look, American players that get a CFL look, I always look at that and I'm thinking, why is that guy getting a look, right? Like he played at a really inferior level, right? Like why is he getting a look when you can't come out of the University of Calgary or Manitoba and get the same look? But it's just an inherent bias. And I've said to GMs, that if a player completely dominated his level, and that level happens to be youth sports, and he shows you that he's got the measurable traits, you've seen his arm talent, you've seen his athletic ability, why won't you give him an opportunity? And they just view it differently. They basically say, if that guy wasn't Canadian, we wouldn't even be talking about him. And that's unfortunate, right? Because when you look at a guy like Brandon Bridge, did being a Canadian help him, or was it a weight? Right? Like, did people say, well, I wouldn't take you, but the GM wants you because you're a token guy for us? Like, did it help him or did it hurt him? Because it didn't help him in the ratio. So to me, when I look at a guy like Brandon Bridge, that type of player in the NCAA is constantly getting an opportunity in the CFL. Did he get the right opportunity? I don't know. So, we'll see what happens with Nathan Rourke, but I'm just glad that, guys like Christian Veilleux and Curtis Rourke and other Canadians are going to get those opportunities, and hopefully it leads to a few of them coming into the CFL.
And this was an issue, especially for those listeners out there who might have been too young back in the 90s when they talked about the debate of Canadians in general as talents, right? When they had the American expansion and Baltimore had all American players. And this was, are Canadians, good enough for them to field that number of players for a team? And you mentioned the Canadians in NCAA. So is there a way to change the stigma in terms of the NCAA? Because there's guys that go there and play, but what is it about maybe the GMs that looking at Canadians as to why there won't be that much of a future for them if they just keep playing youth sports? Do you think that it might take away from some of the impact to youth sports, or do you think that youth sports players should try to see if they can get their hand or their crack at playing in an NCAA team?
Yeah, if you're going to the NCAA from youth sports because you want to get into the CFL, that's probably fool's gold, right? Like, you want to make that kind of a decision just, to come into this league with those kinds of dollars. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. When you look at what Dean Leonard has done and what Tavius Robinson has done going to Ole Miss from Calgary and Guelph respectively, and they've made an instant impact, it makes sense for those guys, and you'll probably see more of that. Like if a guy really does some damage earlier in his career and they feel they've done everything they can do at a youth sports level, might they take a chance to go down? Potentially. But it's also going to be harder because there's not going to be as many roster spots, right? I mean, this year, understand that a number of schools had opt-outs, and because of those opt-outs, they were able to bring other guys in later in the process on a short-term scholarship, right? Where they didn't have to project that guy out over 5 years. They could give him a couple of years and it would be okay. So I don't know that as many opportunities are going to be there because there'll be less uncertainty at the NCAA level. But if you do it because you think it'll give you a chance to play in the NFL, great, try it. If you do it because you think it'll make you viewed differently when you come back to the CFL, I'm not sure you necessarily need to do that. Because, when you look at the top 20 in the rankings, the majority of them are now NCAA guys. But understand the narrative around those guys also changes because will they get NFL opportunities? So the higher people think you're going to go in the NFL draft, the lower you're going to go in the CFL draft because they think they may not see you, right? Like a guy like Chase Claypool is a perfect example, right? I mean, people here knew they just weren't going to see him up here, right? So it's just going to get, I don't think you really need to go down there to wind up playing in the CFL. I think the narrative around the CFL player is we're going to draft him, we're going to get value. We might have to wait a little longer to see that guy on the field. But, you'd be surprised at the number of U Sports linemen that play early in their CFL career. Guys that got drafted, even in the second or third round, and all of a sudden you get to camp and coach looks at him and says, wow, that guy's pretty good. And, they get the opportunity. And I think understanding the yard off the ball of the game in the lineman positions helps as much as anything, right? So, and that's usually who gets drafted higher in the CFL draft. So, more quality players from the NCAA available in the CFL draft, but some of those guys also trying the NFL, which opens up the door for U Sports guys.
Absolutely. And you mentioned with linemen that understanding of being the yard off the ball definitely does help. And I've actually seen it. It's interesting you mentioned that. I've actually never stopped to think about that thought out loud with many U Sports players that get drafted as linemen and end up playing way sooner than you'd think. I remember colleague of mine, Darius Sirocco with Hamilton, was drafted and started playing and was starting way faster than people would have expected. And those kinds of things happen. And quite honestly, I think that's one of the benefits of U Sports players being so heavily favored as linemen in the CFL draft, because you can never have enough talent on the line. And you look at the success that the Bombers have had slowly building up towards their Grey Cup victory. A lot of their Canadians playing U Sports, and a lot of guys that they were able to build into that system were able to give them the success they needed to be able to run the ball efficiently and also to pass the ball effectively. So that is definitely a great point. Now I want to take a bit of a transition and backpedal a little from the CFL here and do a little bit more of a spotlight on your career in terms of the things that you've done with your work. So you've been known for working for TSN for many years now and are based out of Vancouver. So talk a little bit about what it was that made you want to get into working on television, or maybe if that just kind of happened by accident because you worked at CKWX radio in Vancouver and you were a Simon Fraser grad, but weren't necessarily, it didn't seem that you were necessarily gunning towards this. So how did that transition kind of happen as to we're ending up in TSN and getting into television?
Yeah, I don't think it was my goal in the beginning, and not because I didn't think it'd be a great job or a great life. It's just more a case of, in Vancouver when I was growing up and in those years when I was in university, there were just so few stations and so few opportunities, right? I mean, we had 3 stations that did sports locally, and the people that were in those jobs had been in there forever, and it didn't show any signs of changing. And so I thought, I'd go to SFU and I majored in communications. I thought eventually I'd wind up getting into PR or something like that. And then I did 3 years as the sports information director there. And I made a lot of contacts in the sports media industry as every SID across the country would. And from there, I just got offered a job producing a radio show. And from there, I had to fill in and be on air. And it just kind of happened where I really enjoyed it and developed a passion for it. And a year later, I got offered a television job at CBC here in Vancouver. So, not only did I do it that way without having planned it. I mean, I've never taken a broadcasting course in my life, but I also didn't have to do it the traditional way back then. Now it's different now. You've got a podcast and you can cut your teeth in broadcasting that way, or do webcasts of junior hockey games or things like that. Those opportunities are out there. But back in my day when you started, you usually would go to like a place like BCIT and get a broadcast degree, and then you would go to some small town, wherever, and working at a tiny little radio station, and hope to God that at some point somebody noticed you and you could make your way back to a big city and get to a big network. And it's so different now, right? Because of the amount of podcasts, and just the internet was just not a thing then when I was in school, and it's just kind of revolutionized the way people get into the industry. So I got really lucky. 95, I got my first TV job. 97, I got hired at TSN, and I've been there ever since.
And for all those who watch CFL and watch the CFL, watching the segments that you and Dave and many of the other panelists talk football and also really break down the league. And it's always so interesting to see the elements of, or even Justin Dunk, he does a lot of good work with the CFL, Three Down Nation, and being an insider as well. So how did you really develop into that CFL role? Because you were doing a number of sports during your early days and being based out of Vancouver, covered the Canucks and the Lions and the Whitecaps. So what really helped you to move more into the role where the CFL is one of your bigger fortes?
Well, I've always had a huge passion for football. I've coached high school football for over 30 years. And it's been my thing. And, there was a time before I got hired at TSN where I actually thought about making football coaching a career, and eventually trying to get into the NCAA and work my way down into the US and do that type of thing. And eventually I decided to stick on the media side, and that's obviously worked out for me. But I think during that process, as I've gotten to know CFL people, I've been able to speak the language differently than a regular journalist would. And I think that people that have had a chance to cover appreciate that, and they recognize that I've got a passion for the game, and that I truly understand the game, and that I contribute to the game. And I think that's mattered to many people. And because of that, they've been more willing to open up. And we've got so many guys that are so deeply involved in the NHL at our network, in that insider role, and have that level of connection. And, for me, I just didn't want to be that guy, because we had so many of them, and I had a greater passion for football. I love hockey. Don't get me wrong. My son plays hockey as well as football, and I've certainly encouraged that. And I love covering the Canucks, but football's been a bigger passion for me. And as a result, it's just lent itself to being able to network and get to know people and have people want to talk to me. Right. I mean, ultimately this industry is about relationships. You usually get your first jobs based on who you know, not what you know. And in terms of an insider role, it really is all about who you know. And I've got a tremendous amount of respect and passion for all levels of football, right? The question I hate the most is, what do you prefer, the CFL or the NFL, right? I love both. And probably my favorite football is the NCAA, right? And honestly, I say that because I think stylistically it combines the best elements of both. So I could go down the street and watch 7-year-olds play football and I'd enjoy it. The sport's part of my fabric, and I think the people around the CFL know that.
And the CFL is an amazing league. And I know that question is so cumbersome when people bring it up, because people just, money or views or fantasy or whatever. But the CFL is such a unique product, and it's such an enjoyable one too. And I often find myself at times, as the years have gone on, just watching whatever CFL game. Being from Winnipeg, being a big Bombers fan, I love watching the Bombers. And when they're out, it's like, oh, well, whatever, the other games don't matter. But over time, it has become more exciting because of, the way that the league has grown and the talent that's continued to be fostered. So it's not really there's not a similar basis for comparison with the NFL, because of, how much of a behemoth it is, but they're both great products. And having that passion for football is certainly important in a role like yours, because it really, like you mentioned, I like the term you use. It makes you speak a different language. Speaking that language is such a crucial part of being able to communicate the message of what is going on in the league and what is going on in the minds of coaches, players, GMs, etc. So the final question I want to ask before we wrap up our time today is, I guess, a two-part question is this: what advice would you give to those who are wanting to start out or to work in an anchoring role or work on television? And the second part of it is, what is the greatest events that you've covered in all the years that you've been working at TSN?
Well, I mean, if you want to get into this industry, I think you need to try to do two things. One is touch as many areas of the industry as you can, because it's tough to just walk in and say, I want to be a host or a reporter at TSN. Usually, whether you're doing it yourself online and kind of cultivating your own profile, or whether you're, doing it on social media, or, go take the path I took, you have to be able to do more than one thing. And I'm finding that now, like truthfully, when I look at the people we're hiring at TSN, I don't think I could get a job today because I mean, and maybe I would have changed my skill set, but we hire content providers. The last couple of people in my role that we've hired were not TV people. They were actually in print, and we decided to convert them and, take advantage of their ability to operate on multiple platforms and provide content. So, the last reporter we hired, like they had to do an assignment basically, which included a TV component, a print component, a social media component, what that would all look like so you could hit a bunch of different elements. For me, I had to learn how to edit, and I had to learn how to, do a number of different things so that I could be invaluable. And, if they needed me to fill in over there, I could fill in over there. If they needed me to take this area on, I could do that, right? So just do as much in the industry as you can. So when you get the first job, you can almost tailor make the position because you could fill in so many areas. And the second thing is to network. It's an industry about relationships. So the more people you know, the more opportunities you're going to get, the more chances you have to make an impression. So, if you are afraid to ask someone like me to be on your podcast, that means you're probably not equipped to do this job because you're not going to have the networking skills or the gumption to attempt to network in order to be there when the opportunities come, right? So, so those are the main things if you want to get the job. And as far as things that I've covered that I've really enjoyed, I need to really go back and research because I ask that a lot and I generally don't have a good answer because I've covered so many good events and, I've done like a dozen Super Bowls. I've done 5 Olympics. I've covered, golf majors, NBA finals, World Series, Stanley Cups, like you name it. I've really been blessed to cover a lot of different things. I would probably say the Olympics are great. I've done the Athens Olympics really stood out for me. The London Olympics were great. Vancouver as well. And NCAA, the college football playoff, I've just totally enjoyed doing that. As much as I love the Super Bowl and the Grey Cup, I totally enjoy doing that. So there's just been so many people I've interviewed and so many places I've had a chance to go. I'm really lucky, and it's hard for me to put one over the other.
Was it very special? Was there a great feeling? You talk about the Olympics to be able to broadcast the Olympics from Vancouver in 2010, being based out of there.
Yeah, I'm really, really a proud Vancouverite. Like as much as being Canadian matters to me, being a BC boy matters more. And maybe you won't like that in Manitoba, but that's how I feel. And so to have the Olympics, like I remember the day when Vancouver got awarded the 2010 Olympics. It was 2003, and I was in the control room at CTV at the time. And when they said Vancouver, I was literally in tears because the city means so much to me, and I grew up here. And to be able to say it was an Olympic city, it was just so awesome. Having covered it, know what the Olympic movement means, to say your city's going to have the Olympics, right? It was really cool when it got awarded. It was great to be able to cover it. I was there when the gold medal in hockey was won. I spent most of my time up at the Sliding Center in Whistler. Just the vibe and the atmosphere you get in an Olympic city during a games, it's indescribable. And just to be able to say that I covered one in my own city. My son at the time was about 1.5 years old, and my wife brought him up to the games for a few days, and I was able just to get pictures with him. At various different places up in Whistler during the games. It was really cool. I got to run in the Olympic torch relay. All of those things associated with the games were really, really special and memorable because it was here at home.
And that's a great way to wrap up. And especially that pride is so important. And, there's no place like home, like they say. And, BC, I love the province of BC. I love Vancouver, amazing city, so beautiful. And I can only sit here and envy knowing that the chances of Winnipeg ever getting an Olympic Games will definitely not as high as Vancouver, but it's
but you almost had a CFL hub.
Yeah, the CFL hub is definitely the next destination is headed for Winnipeg. But yeah, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to just feel the raw euphoria and emotion of knowing how much the city means to you and to see that they get the greatest international sporting spectacle. It doesn't get any better than that. And I honestly, especially the Sidney Crosby golden goal to have been there, Chris Cuthbert's call, the end of regulation, the way we scored and everything. Those moments are the ones that we live for. And I look forward to seeing more of those as we go into the future and as we move towards developing, safer public health and making sure that we have the opportunity to be back on the field, to be back in the court, and to be back on the ice for sure. So with that, I want to thank you, Farhan, so much for being on today's episode. It was a super awesome time. And I'm really glad that you're able to share your stories and all the insight that you have with Canadian football, as well as the work that you've done in your career.
Thanks for having me, Matthias, and give my best to Coach Dobie.
I absolutely will. Coach Dobie, you're the man. Thank you so much. Well, with that, everyone, thank you for listening to today's episode of Farhan Lalji, CFL Insider and TSN Broadcaster.